For years, the neighborhood was painted as a perfect suburban dream. Rows of houses stood in carefully matched tones of beige, taupe, and cream. Their lawns cut like carpets, their hedges clipped to identical shapes. It was a place where everything was supposed to be in harmony. But beneath the manicured calm lived an invisible tension, a force that dictated the smallest details of daily life, the homeowners association. When I first moved in, I thought of the HOA as nothing more than a formality, a group of volunteers who organized seasonal events, oversaw maintenance of the common areas, and made sure the neighborhood stayed presentable. At least, that was the impression they sold to prospective buyers. What I didn't know was that behind the carefully written newsletters and overly cheerful holiday parties, the HOA ruled with an iron grip. Every flower planted, every fence built, every light fixture replaced had to be approved. And if it wasn't, the consequences were swift, unforgiving, and expensive. Still, I believed I could manage. My house had good bones but was dated, and I wanted to invest in it slowly. It wasn't about flipping for a profit. This was where I intended to raise my family, where I wanted roots. The first project I set my mind to was the windows. The originals were decades old, drafty, and constantly fogging between panes. It was a simple upgrade, or so I thought. I submitted the paperwork to the HOA design committee. There were forms, samples, and even a mandatory wait period. I chose a style nearly identical to what I had, only slightly more energy efficient, with a slim modern trim that would improve insulation. Weeks later, I received the stamped approval. It was short, sterile, and bureaucratic, but it was approval nonetheless. The project went ahead. The installation was uneventful. In a single weekend, contractors removed the rotting frames, sealed the new panes, and left the house looking refreshed. Neighbors passed by and complimented the improvement, some even asking which company I used. I kept the HOA approval letter in a file folder, confident that I'd done everything by the book. For 5 years, nothing happened. Life moved along at its usual pace. The neighborhood had its gossip, its cliques, and its whispers, but my windows never came up again. I paid my dues, kept my yard neat, and nodded politely at the board president whenever our paths crossed. She was the kind of woman who carried herself like a monarch, always watching, always judging, but never directly engaging unless she smelled weakness. Then out of nowhere, a letter arrived. It was written in the HOA cold, impersonal format, but its words carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. According to the board, my windows were in violation of community standards. They claimed the trim style I had chosen was unapproved, that it disrupted the visual consistency of the neighborhood, and that I owed a fine of $12,000 for a non-compliance and ongoing violation. I thought it had to be a mistake. I dug out my approval letter, scanned it twice, and even checked the date against my installation receipt. Everything matched. Everything had been done with their blessing. Yet here they were, rewriting history and demanding a sum that was more than a small fortune. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error. I reached out politely, asking for clarification. What I received in return was a curt message, dismissing my concerns and insisting the fine was valid. The president herself signed the notice, underlining her authority in bold strokes of ink. That was when I realized what I was up against. This wasn't about windows. This wasn't about community standards. It was about power. The board had decided to flex its influence, and I had been chosen as the example. In the weeks that followed, the pressure mounted. Late notices stacked up, each carrying additional penalties. I gathered every scrap of documentation I could find, built binders of evidence, and scheduled consultations. The first few attorneys I spoke to seemed hesitant. Fighting in HOA was notoriously draining. Their power structures were designed to exhaust homeowners into submission. But finally, I found one who didn't flinch. He looked at the approval letter, then at the lien threat, and said the words I needed to hear. You have a case. Of course, having a case and winning it were two different things. The HOA had funds, after all. Every resident's dues contributed to their legal war chest. They could afford to drag things out, to pile motion after motion until I drowned in paperwork. My savings, meanwhile, dwindled as the months stretched on. What kept me going was the principle. I refused to let them bully me into compliance for something they themselves had signed off on. The neighborhood atmosphere grew colder. The board began whispering at community gatherings casting me as the problem homeowner, the rebel, threatening harmony. Rumors spread that I was refusing to follow rules, that I thought I was above everyone else. Some neighbors stopped waving, others stopped talking altogether. A few quietly encouraged me, saying they admired my stance, but always with lowered voices, like they were afraid someone might overhear and report them. Meanwhile, the president strutted through the subdivision as if nothing could touch her. She chaired meetings with even more arrogance, weaving my supposed defiance into cautionary tales. She thought she was untouchable, certain that her control over the HOA would shield her from consequences. But arrogance has a way of blinding people to cracks forming beneath their feet. Our first court hearing came on a gray morning, the kind where clouds hang low, and everything feels heavier than it should. I walked into the courtroom with my lawyer and that folder of documents I had been guarding like treasure. Across the aisle sat the HOA legal team, backed by funds that I knew came from the pockets of every neighbor in the community, including mine. And sitting smugly in the gallery was the president herself, her expression one of quiet satisfaction, as though she was already savoring victory. The judge listened patiently as both sides laid out their arguments. The HOA insisted the windows violated architectural standards. My lawyer presented the approval letter, sliding it across the bench like the ace of spades. For the first time, I saw the president's confidence falter, just slightly. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the paper that contradicted her entire narrative. The hearing ended without a ruling. It was only the beginning, the first step in a drawn-out process. But walking out of that courtroom, I felt a shift. For the first time in months, the weight pressing on my chest eased slightly. I wasn't powerless. I had evidence, and the HOA knew it. Still, the battle was far from over. The board doubled down with new tactics. They began nitpicking everything about my property. Letters arrived accusing me of grass being too long, of trash cans being visible from the street, of my mailbox needing repainting. Each violation carried fines. It was harassment, plain and simple, a campaign designed to wear me down until I broke. But instead of breaking, it only steeled my resolve. I documented everything, every petty letter, every accusation, every unexplained fee. I knew the more they pushed, the stronger my case became, and though it drained me, financially, emotionally, mentally, I refused to back down. Little did I know that this fight, which began over $12,000 and a set of windows, would eventually grow into something far bigger. Because in trying so hard to crush me, the HOA was planting the seeds of its own undoing. And years later, when the reckoning came, it wouldn't be me scrambling to pay them. It would be their president, pen in hand, forced to sign a check worth $75,000 with my name written across it. But before that day came, the war had to escalate even further. And it did. The months that followed felt like living under siege. Every week, another letter appeared in my mailbox, sealed in the HOA distinctive logo. Each one carried the same tone of cold authority, demanding action, assigning blame, and threatening consequences. It was no longer just about the windows. Now they accused me of letting weeds sprout in my flower beds, of failing to edge my lawn precisely along the sidewalk, even of leaving holiday decorations up too long after the season ended. None of it was true, or at least none of it was outside the bounds of normal life. I kept my yard trimmed, my house clean, my decorations timely, yet the board found fault in everything. It wasn't enforcement, it was harassment. They weren't protecting community standards. They were targeting me, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. The isolation deepened. People who once stopped by to chat now crossed the street when they saw me outside. I overheard whispers during walks with my dog, fragments of gossip about a troublemaker, and then the lawsuit. The president had turned my resistance into a spectacle, a warning to others about what happened when you defied her. She fed on that fear, using me as an example to keep the rest of the neighborhood compliant. The toll weighed heavily. My legal bills stacked higher each month, draining savings I had planned for my children's education. Sleep became elusive. Every creak of the house at night reminded me of the weight pressing down on my life. There were moments when I thought about giving in, just paying the fine, repainting the mailbox, whatever it took to make the harassment stop. But then I would look at that approval letter dated and signed, and anger would replace despair. They had approved my windows. That fact was unshakable. And if I surrendered, I would be admitting guilt where none existed. My lawyer urged patience. Every petty violation they send only strengthens your case, he told me. And though the waiting felt unbearable, I held on to that truth. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. It started with a neighbor, one of the quiet ones who rarely attended HOA meetings. He slipped a note into my mailbox one evening, unsigned but unmistakably sympathetic. In it, he admitted the board had once fined him for painting his garage door the wrong shade of beige, even though it had matched the sample they gave him. He paid the fine to avoid conflict, but now, seeing my fight, he wished he hadn't. More stories trickled in quietly, discreetly. A woman fined for installing a small flower bed without approval. A family charged thousands for replacing their roof shingles with a brand that HOA claimed wasn't on their official list, a list they refused to show anyone. The pattern was clear. This wasn't about me. The HOA had been abusing its power for years, but I was the first to push back. The realization gave me strength. What I was enduring wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And the more I uncovered, the more I understood why the president was so determined to crush me. If I won, it would expose the rot at the heart of her rule. Court dates came and went, hearings stacked up, and the case dragged forward. The HOA lawyers tried to bury us in paperwork, requesting endless documents, depositions, and delays. But every time my lawyer countered with precision, the approval letter remained our cornerstone, unshakable and undeniable. No matter how many accusations they piled on, they could not erase that single piece of paper. Still, the financial strain nearly broke me. I picked up extra work, cut expenses, and lived tightly just to keep pace with the mounting legal costs. On the other, more and more residents were quietly rooting for me, even if few dared to admit it openly. The president seemed blind to the shift, still convinced she ruled unchallenged. But I could sense the balance of power beginning to tilt. The courtroom battles became longer, sharper, more exhausting. The HOA lawyers argued relentlessly, grasping at technicalities and obscure interpretations of bylaws. They tried to discredit the emails, dismissing them as taken out of context, but the judge wasn't blind. He read the words for himself, his expression hardening with every page. Then came the day of the pivotal hearing. The courtroom was packed with residents filling the benches, drawn by curiosity and quiet rebellion. The HOA had tried to keep things quiet, but word had spread. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was about the very soul of the community. The president sat stiffly in the front row, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on me with cold disdain. She still carried herself like royalty, but the cracks were undeniable. Her confidence was forced now, her composure brittle, and when the judge addressed the emails directly, her mask slipped. I watched her shift uncomfortably, her lips pressed tight, knowing she couldn't explain away the evidence staring back at her. The hearing stretched for hours. My lawyer laid out the pattern of harassment, backed by documents, letters, and witness statements from neighbors brave enough to speak. The HOA attorneys countered with every tactic they could, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. This was no longer about windows. It was about abuse of power. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt the air change. Neighbors who once avoided me now stopped to offer quiet words of encouragement. One even patted my shoulder, whispering that she hoped I wouldn't give up. For the first time, the president was no longer the unchallenged ruler of the neighborhood. Her iron grip was loosening, and people were beginning to see her for what she truly was. But the fight was far from over. The HOA wasn't ready to surrender. Instead, they launched one final, desperate counterattack. They filed a countersuit, accusing me of damaging the neighborhood's reputation, claiming my resistance had driven down property values. It was an outrageous accusation, but it forced yet another round of hearings. More delays, more expenses. The stress reached a breaking point. Nights were sleepless, days consumed by endless paperwork and strategy sessions with my lawyer. I could feel the toll in every part of my life, yet I refused to give in. The more they pushed, the more determined I became. Because by now, it wasn't just about me. It was about every resident who had ever been bullied into silence, every neighbor too afraid to fight back. And deep down, I knew the president had made a fatal mistake. By pushing too far, she had overplayed her hand. She believed she could break me, but instead she had revealed her own corruption to the world. The cracks in her empire were spreading, and soon the entire foundation would collapse. The war had reached its peak. The only thing left was the final showdown, where the truth would be laid bare and the outcome decided once and for all. What none of us knew then was just how costly that final chapter would be for the HOA and how much sweeter the victory would taste when the president herself was forced to pay. The final showdown came after nearly 2 years of drawn-out hearings, depositions, and endless filings. By the time the court set the trial date, I was running on fumes. My savings had been drained, my patience tested, my life consumed by the war with the HOA. Yet standing on the courthouse steps that morning, I knew this was the moment everything had been building toward. Either I would lose everything, or the truth would finally set me free. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Nearly every bench was filled with residents from the neighborhood, curious to witness the climax of the drama that had hung over them for years. Some came out of loyalty to the president, but many came out of hope. Hope that the stranglehold of fear and fines might finally be broken. The president entered like a queen walking to her throne. Her chin lifted, her stride slow and deliberate. But I noticed what others might not have. The stiffness in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw. She wore her confidence like armor, but beneath it, cracks had already formed. The trial began with the HOA attorneys presenting their case. They clung to their narrative with desperation, insisting that my windows violated standards, that my resistance had disrupted the community, that my refusal to pay fines had forced the HOA to act. They waved bylaws and policies like weapons, filling the air with legal jargon meant to overwhelm. But then came our turn. My lawyer stood calmly, methodically laying out the evidence. First, the original approval letter, the very foundation of the case. It was held up before the court, dated, signed, undeniable. The courtroom was silent as the judge examined it, the weight of its simplicity cutting through months of chaos. Next came the stack of violation letters, each more petty and ridiculous than the last. Grass height, mailbox paint, trash can placement. Together they formed a pattern so transparent it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't enforcement, it was retaliation. And finally, the emails. The words of the president herself, in her own writing, admitting the windows had been approved, admitting the need to make an example, admitting the intent to bury me under fines until I cracked. When the words were read aloud, the courtroom seemed to shift. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the benches, and even the judge's expression darkened. The president sat rigid in her chair, eyes locked on the table before her. The composure she had fought so hard to maintain was slipping away, piece by piece. Every line of text stripped away her authority, leaving her exposed not as a leader, but as a tyrant. Witnesses were called next. A neighbor testified about watching the installation of my windows, about seeing the HOA members inspect them without objection. Another spoke of their own fines, describing a climate of fear and intimidation under the president's rule. One by one, voices joined together, painting a picture of a community suffocated by abuse. By the time the final statements were made, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't about windows. It wasn't about community standards. It was about power wielded recklessly, cruelly, and without accountability. When the judge delivered his ruling, the air in the courtroom was electric. He declared the HOA had acted in bad faith, that the fines were invalid, that the campaign against me was targeted harassment. The lien threat was dismissed entirely. But more than that, the judge awarded damages, $75,000. The words echoed in my head as though I hadn't heard them right. $75,000, compensation for the stress, the financial toll, the abuse of authority. And who would sign that check? None other than the HOA itself with the president's name at the bottom. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur, neighbors turning to one another with wide eyes. Some smiled, others shook their heads in disbelief. The president sat frozen, her face drained of color, her hands clenched tight against the table. For years she had ruled unchecked. For years, she had crushed dissent with fines and fear. And now, she was the one humiliated, forced to bow under the weight of her own arrogance. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The fight wasn't just won, it was vindicated. I had stood against the machine, and I had emerged victorious. The president's empire had crumbled, and for the first time the neighborhood felt free to breathe again. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because while the judgment had been made and the victory secured, the true consequences for the president and the changes for the community were still to come. And those consequences would reshape the neighborhood forever.